Hello and welcome to another video looking at another poem by Kayo Chingonyi. Today we're looking at the poem Some Bright Elegance, again from the collection Kumukanda. I'll do the usual disclaimer that I do with all my videos, which is to say this is essentially a look at some of the meanings and some of the bits of information about this poem that could be interesting for you to develop your interpretation of the poem, specifically if you're studying the Cambridge IGCSE and this is the poet that you are going to look at for your poetry exam. As always, I need to add that this won't be a fully comprehensive list of every poetic technique. We're not here to spot techniques that are being used, mainly because Cambridge doesn't really want you to do that either. This is hopefully a resource you can use to develop your personal response to this poem, Some Bright Elegance. So let's start with the title itself, Some Bright Elegance. Now, this was actually the title of a small collection of poetry, and it was the first thing ever published by Kayo Chingonyi. Perhaps not something you'd include in an interpretation, but just interesting for your own knowledge that this is some of the poet's earlier work. The phrase itself is actually taken from another poem by a poet called Amiri Baraka. This was a person who was a poet, a writer, an activist, at times a controversial figure, but Baraka is someone who devoted his life to promoting Black consciousness and identity. And actually, the phrase Some Bright Elegance is taken from his poem, The Dance. So immediately we get this conversation or connection with another artist, another figure who is interested in Black identity and specifically dance and music. And this is precisely what Chingonyi's poem is also about. Now, in many ways, this is echoing what we discussed with the poem The Colour of James Brown's Scream, which you can look at here or here. And in that poem, we were thinking about the transformational effect of music and dance. Some Bright Elegance also looks at Black identity and dance and considers mainly what dance means and what dance makes possible when it comes to identity and specifically the Black identity. Now, as well as being an allusion to another poem, it's worth considering the title in its own right. Of course, Chingonyi didn't write this specific phrase, but he did take it or borrow it for his own poem and clearly found some sort of significance in the words Some Bright Elegance. And I think I can see that also. There is this bright elegance which suggests something which is instantly recognizable and undeniable, but by being some, it seems to give it this sort of intangible quality. And I think this speaks to dance in particular. It speaks to this feeling of being lost in dance or watching someone dance and feeling like they are in somehow a transcendental state, that they are, and we use this phrase quite a lot, lost to dance. And obviously this is heightened further when we consider what dance means for Black communities against the reality of racism and discrimination. And this is exactly what the poem discusses. So let's dive in.
For the screw-faced in good shoes that paper the walls of dance halls, I have little patience. I say dance not to be seen, but free. Your feet are made for better things. Feel the bitterness in you lift as it did for a 6-year-old Bojangles, tapping a living out of beer garden patios to the delight of a crowd that wasn't lynching today, but laughing at the quickness of the kid.
This poem almost begins by being dedicated to people at an event, but they're not dancing. Instead, they are screw-faced and they're in good shoes. Now, this word screw-faced, if you're not familiar, is very common in UK street culture. Generally, it refers to a facial expression of someone who is frustrated or even angry, and it carries some connotations of even initiating violence. I think there's another interpretation of screwface when the bass is particularly devastating, or there's a drop that is in some way nasty. I'm not going down that side of things. We're thinking more about screwface as this some sort of expression of disgust or, again, frustration. It's a piece of slang or idiomatic language, and this is something that Chingonyi does so effectively. He reveals the poetry of everyday language, and especially of contemporary urban language, the way that people speak, the way that normal, regular people speak, especially in sort of urban communities. Another example of how the word screwface is used or what it means is in the song Screwface Capital by the rapper Dave. And in that, he suggests that London as a city is characterized by perhaps this sort of negative or confrontational attitude, dubbing it Screwface Capital. So Chingonyi immediately, through this use of idiomatic language, locates us within a contemporary space. You know, it could be a dance, music event, rap event, grime event, whatever, that happens every Friday or Saturday night around the country, around the UK, and by extension, you know, around the world. But we are absolutely entitled to interpret and think about what connotations these words have. You know, for example, we think about the word screw, which is hidden in the word screwface. And I think about, you know, a literal screw that's used as something that you sort of screw into a wall. It has connotations of hardness and lifelessness. And it resonates with the way that people are only papering the walls of the dance hall. You can actually imagine them standing with their backs to the walls and just watching the dance floor judgmentally. But it's amazing that in just one line, Chingonyi makes this distinction so clearly between them being lifeless in contrast with the vivacious dancers that are full of life, as we see in stanza 2. And it's these connotations of words like paper and screw, which really gives it this powerful contrasting effect. We also get this use of internal rhyme between walls and halls, and it builds up a bit of a rhythm, but then it interrupts immediately with this use of a comma for caesura. And the poet declares, or the speaker declares, I have little patience. And there's something very abrupt and quite amusing about this, the way that we go from sort of idiomatic language to a much almost formal register. And this is extremely intentional. We should pay attention to the structure of the poem, and these people, the ones that choose not to dance, and instead look judgmentally in their good shoes. You know, their shoes are good because they don't dance. They are immediately discarded in this poem. It's almost like it begins a dedication towards them. But immediately the poet says, I have little patience, and gets rid of them, because this poem isn't about them. This is very much a call to dance and a celebration of the ones who choose to dance. And in some ways, a celebration of those who have no choice but to dance. We're going to get to that. So following up on this opening pair of lines, the poet really sets out the message of the poem. Okay, it's pretty much here in the first stanza what Some Bright Elegance is all about. And it's done so in these lovely and mainly monosyllabic words. I say dance, not to be seen but free. Your feet are made for better things. He's essentially saying, dance. Don't dance for others, dance for yourself. And what we begin to think about with these words is the question of what does dance do? Not thinking about what dance is, but what does dance do? Notice how the poet phrases this. It's declarative. It takes the form almost of a command. The command is given from the personal pronoun of the poet, I, to the reader through the possessive pronoun your. And it creates a sort of intimacy in the poem. And this idea that the poet is compelling us to do something. In terms of thinking about this in terms of poetic techniques, if you're doing Cambridge IGCSE, thinking about AO3, you can start to think here about tone as a technique. And it certainly is. Tone is really powerful, but in some ways at times it can feel difficult to talk about. But what tone does this opening have? Because I think it does continue throughout the poem. You know, you might think of words like persuasive, didactic, imperative, authoritative, motivational, maybe at times even admonishing. And the poet continues with the use of the imperative in this next sentence. Feel the bitterness in you lift. So the idea here that by dancing, we can rid ourselves of negativity and bitterness. To exemplify that or to illustrate that, the poet takes us from this imagined dance hall that we assume to be contemporary, and we go back to a moment in history. So let's break down these lines. Feel the bitterness in you lift as it did for a 6-year-old Bojangles, tapping a living out of Richmond beer gardens. Now, where are we? We're not in Richmond near London. We're in Richmond, Virginia, in the United States, and Bojangles here is a real person, someone by the name of Bill Robinson, an extremely famous tap dancer. He's a really fascinating figure. Bill Robinson's parents both died when he was quite young. He was brought up by his grandmother, and from the age of 5, he would dance in the streets as a busker to earn money to survive. He's a very talented young boy, very talented dancer. Actually, in terrible and sort of horrific irony, he was discovered dancing outside of theatres where minstrel shows were being performed. And minstrel shows would typically involve white performers in blackface who would mock racial stereotypes of African Americans on stage for overwhelmingly white audiences. And he was, and this is basically how Bojangles made his break into the show business. Bill Bojangles Robinson, a fascinating and very famous and very talented figure from dance history. And what Chingonyi does is draws our attention to a time where blackness and dancing is directly linked to racism, discrimination, and ultimately survival. So you notice here how Chingonyi shows this relationship through the language. A 6-year-old Bojangles tapping a living out of a Richmond beer gardens to the delight of a crowd that wasn't lynching today, but laughing at the quickness of the kid. So these contrasting verbs are all in this gerund form: tapping, living, lynching, laughing. And this isn't an exaggeration. This is a serious thing. We're thinking about the deep south of America, or certainly southern America, and we're thinking about the cruelty of racism, the extreme cruelty of racism at that time. Chingonyi is drawing our attention to the hardships and extreme dangers of existence for Black people. And they are juxtaposed with the levity and joy of dance. And that's sort of highlighted by the use of alliteration here at the end, with this hard k sound, the quickness of the kid. Bill Robinson is a fascinating figure, and I'd love to go into more detail here, but the point here is how Chingonyi draws our attention to what dance makes possible. And even in the face of the most terrible discrimination and hatred, how dance can almost elevate us out of these situations, as suggested precisely by the word lift. But it's impossible to avoid how delicately balanced this is, how the performance to the delight of the crowd can quickly turn laughing to lynching. Really interesting part of the poem, and quite shocking as well.
Throw yourself into the thick, emerging pure, reduced to flesh and bone, nerve and sinew. Your folded arms understand music. Channel a Pat Savoy ballroom and slide across the dusty floor as your zoot-suited 20s self. The feather in your hat from an ostrich, the swagger in your step from the ochre dust of a West African village. Dance for the times.
So from stanza 1, we go to the second stanza, and the poet continues this tone of compelling us to do something in the second stanza. Again, he's talking directly to us, the reader. And if we remember how the first stanza began with the lifelessness of screws and shoes and paper and these people that choose not to dance, now we see what the dance is really made of. And Chingonyi does this through the use of figurative language. Throw yourself into the thick, emerging, pure, reduced to flesh and bone, nerve and sinew. So the poet uses imagery along with metaphor, and remember that, imagery often uses figurative language. They work together to create sort of vivid ideas in poems. And this imagery is based on almost the anatomy of the human body, to show how dance is something that is so intensely human. It's part of what we are. It's what we're made of. Dance becomes an extension of our bodies. The dance is made of us, flesh, bone, nerve, and sinew. Very striking use of imagery there. And also what happens here, and this is a technique that poets do all the time, they start playing with the syntax of language to express something that perhaps is almost beyond expression. So I would argue that at the beginning of this second stanza, the syntax breaks down somewhat. So the poet asks us to throw yourself into the thick, emerging, pure, reduced to flesh and bone, nerve and sinew. Are we throwing ourselves into the thick, or are we throwing ourselves into the thick emerging pure? Does the comma here suggest a list of modifying adjectives, or does it actually denote a new clause? These may appear at first to be sort of finicky grammatical issues, but the point here is that the poet introduces some sort of ambiguity into the syntax and the language itself. And I think this in many ways reflects the way that dance often breaks down barriers. We feel ourselves let go of our inhibitions when we dance, and it reduces us in many ways as humans down into something much more primal or primordial, perhaps even a purer version of ourselves that grammatically correct language cannot fully capture. Always pay attention to syntax and the way, if you're reading a poem and you think that sentence feels a bit weird, I can't quite understand what is the subject and the object, or what is the primary verb here, pay attention to that, because it's often intentional and it can mean something. The poet continues with this single sentence here: your folded arms understand music. And obviously, this is another powerful use of imagery, that the body language of folded arms is sort of unequivocally suggestive of refusal or reluctance. But Chingonyi personifies these folded arms and suggests that this part of our body understands music. It almost suggests this idea that we need to listen to our bodies, that naturally there is this idea that our bodies want to be connected to dance, and we're actually the ones that try and deny them this. So our folded arms understand music, full stop, and then, again, the poet tells us to do something, this time imagine. And this leads into another sequence going across history. And this single word here, imagine, followed by sort of the extensive use of enjambment, it really sort of takes us on a journey through time in many ways. This time, where are we going? Well, we are imagining ourselves on a packed Savoy ballroom. Now, the Savoy is a popular music venue in 1920s New York, and it takes us here with the mention of the zoot suit of the 20s, the feather in the hat, and the swagger in the step. We're going back to a specific moment in time, which is the Harlem Renaissance or Renaissance. And first of all, let's pay attention to the way the poet describes this place. This is a packed ballroom, and there's dusty floor, and there's this ostentatious feather in your hat. I love the way that he's putting us into that position. He almost wants us to feel like we're there and we're living that experience. And it is a place that is full of life and energy. Now, why does Chingonyi want us to think about this moment in time in particular? And this period of time was essentially when Black communities would proudly express their heritage through music, dance, and indeed fashion. So the zoot suit and the ostrich feather, these are basically symbols. This is a use of symbolism of defiance and unapologetic Blackness. The Harlem Renaissance gets its name, the word Renaissance meaning rebirth. This name comes from this idea of the Black identity being born again from the terrible discrimination and oppression of slavery and the period immediately after the emancipation from slavery, and the very slow and painful process that was, into a new age where Black people could be their unapologetic selves. And this is why fashion is such an important part of that process. It's a moment in time when the clothes one wore were also a political statement. The ostrich feather is a symbol of exotic otherness. And within the Harlem Renaissance, many people would incorporate exotic elements such as animal prints to, in many ways, reclaim their African heritage and combine it with sort of exuberant tailoring to symbolize the rebirth of a new Black identity. And then we get more gorgeous imagery here, the swagger in your step from the ochre dust of a West African village. So the allusion here to a West African village, it's very charged. Considering what I just said about the use of fashion as a way of reclaiming sort of African identity or creating an authentic African American identity, we have to perhaps think about this reference to a West African village. The thing that it reminded me of was the line from Kendrick Lamar's The Blacker the Berry, where he says he has the heritage of a small village, pardon my residence. In both cases, I believe both Kayo and Kendrick want to draw our attention to, African-American identity, which ultimately begins with the slave trade. And this is where these communities basically are drawn from, West African villages. So the sibilance of the swagger in the step is intimately associated with this image of the ochre dust, which comes from the villages that these communities were violently taken from. And again, thinking back to Bojangles, and we're thinking about this idea of dance as survival and as a way of finding beauty in situations of oppression and suffering. And to use Kendrick's terminology, we're thinking about the heritage of Black culture. Where does it come from, and how do we continue to celebrate it? I think this is a question that Kayo Chingonyi is asking here, and it's something that runs throughout Kumukanda. Now notice here the repeated reference to dust, the dusty floor of the ballroom and the dust from the West African village. And this is clearly intentional. So this is something that I want to be a challenge for you. What do you think is the significance of dust here? What can dust represent? How does it relate to some of the basic ideas of the poem? Have a think about where else in life or in culture do you hear dust being referred to? And can you make a link between that and some of the themes or some of the meanings that we've discussed in this poem? I would love for you to have a think about that and post your ideas below. So we leave the Savoy Ballroom now and we come to the end of the second stanza. The poet uses enjambment to draw a connection between the stanzas. And again, once again, the connection is made through the use of imperative verbs. As a little game activity, go through this poem and circle every imperative verb every time the poet's telling you, the reader, to do something. You're going to find a lot. And that's what I think contributes to this tone of persuasion or compelling us to do something. And what the poet is asking us to do is dance for the times. And I thought this was a really clever little line before we move on to the third stanza. And it's worth thinking about and pause on this idea of the times. Because what we're going to see in the third stanza is that the times refers to the lived experiences of the reader. And obviously we use the phrase the times to mean the number of separate occasions. So can you remember the times you went to visit your grandparents, for example? So that's one way of interpreting the times. But we do also think about the times as a way of referencing different eras or historical periods. And we have expressions like a sign of the times, or the Bob Dylan song, The Times They Are A-Changin'. And there's a bit of a slippage between the present and the past, which we're going to talk about a bit more, because I think that's really significant. And this is also a poem that's always slipping between different time periods and wanting to draw, again, connections. So I really like this way that the second stanza ends and we go into this third stanza thinking about the times.
You've been stalked by store detectives. For a lady on a bus, for the look of disgust on the face of a boy too young to understand why he hates, only that he must. Dance for Sammy, dead and penniless, and for the thousands still scraping a buck as street corner hoofers, who though they dance for their food, move as if it is just them, and the drums talking.
So, stanza 3, what times are we being told to dance for? What we get here is a series of images, and they're all tied together through rhyme and alliteration. So dance for the times you've been stalked by store detectives, from a lady on a bus for the look of disgust on the face of a boy too young to understand why he hates, but only that he must. Okay, so I'm exaggerating there the sibilance that runs through it, but this sound, it's always quite sinister. We inevitably think about snakes and think that this use of sibilance creates a sort of sinister undercurrent to the poem that connects together these different moments of everyday racism faced by Black people, by people of colour in contemporary society. Now, obviously, Chingonyi is writing from a British perspective, but I'm sure there are parallels or similar situations faced by victims of racism around the world. And these instances are also connected through rhyme, okay? So we get the look of disgust, the lady on a bus, and the fact that the boy hates because he feels he must, okay? This really captures the web of related experiences that reflects the lived experience of modern racism. So this isn't the threat of perhaps lynching that Bojangles faced, but it's the animosity felt towards or felt by people of colour who live in places like the UK. And this animosity that so often comes from places of ignorance, which is captured by this young boy who feels like he must hate this person even though he doesn't know why. He has essentially been educated to hate. And we think about how racism is a learned behaviour. It's something that people are taught to do. It's not something that comes naturally to us. What does come naturally to us in the logic of the poem is dance and togetherness. Maybe that's something that the poet wants us to think about. These examples from everyday life are chosen by Chingonyi, and they're almost certainly going to resonate with people of colour, particularly those who live in the UK, I would imagine, because looking across the web and looking across social media, these experiences come up quite a lot from people, whether it's the rise of hate crime on buses and public transport, or the way that people are racially profiled when entering into places like supermarkets and having security follow them around. There's a line from Skepta as well where he says, "Security guard follow me around like I ain't got £2 to pay for my juice." But this is something that rappers are also aware of, because it's a reality for those who suffer everyday racism and things that we might refer to as microaggressions. So in many ways, Chingonyi here is directly speaking to certain communities who feel like they're victims of discrimination in many different ways, and encouraging them to rise above this, and encouraging them to dance as a way of rising above this, just as others have done in the past. Okay, so then getting towards the end of the poem, and we see the poet here using repetition with these imperative verbs. Dance for the times, and now dance for Sammy. We get this image here of the harsh realities of street performers with this mention of Sammy. And Chingonyi suggests that Sammy represents the thousands of people who dance for their literal survival, making money to live on, just as Bojangles did when he was just a child. Now, I've done some research. I can't necessarily find who this Sammy refers to. If you have an idea why the name Sammy was used, please post it in the comments below. That would be very interesting to me. I feel that Chingonyi uses a proper name here, the name of Sammy, precisely to draw our attention to the thousands of people who are, in many ways, nameless. People who are forgotten, who are poor, destitute, and homeless, and who are totally marginalised by society. But they dance, nevertheless. And I mean, the situation that these people live in, and these are realities, this is a reality for many people, is really captured by this verb, scraping. Okay? You think how scraping really captures an idea of desperation and poverty, and the way that these people exist on next to nothing. And it's from this figure of Sammy that we get the final line and final image of the homeless street performers who dance like it's just them and the drums talking. Now, what are these drums here? Perhaps they're the ones performed on by the street performers, but for me, the mention of drums transports me all the way back to this West African village, and perhaps even further back to the very origins of human civilization. We know that music and dance has for so long been a part of human civilization, and it's so often been a social and communal act. And the use of the verb talking to end the poem on, I think is really beautiful and really important, because talking is suggestive of a conversation, and conversations are always inclusive and they work in both directions. And in this case, it's the street corner hoofers and the drums that are talking to each other. So these people who are very much marginalized and excluded from society, they still preserve and capture the spirit of music and dance, which always gives them some sort of belonging, some sort of place to be. Even when society excludes us, we can always belong in the dance. It's something inherently human that no level of hate can take away from us. And that brings us all the way back to this big question of who do we dance for? When we perform for others like Bojangles did, or like the hungry street performers do, is it possible that at the very same time we're also dancing for ourselves? That even in these situations of hardship, we can still capture an essence of freedom and liberation? This is such a fascinating question, and one of the reasons why I love poetry, because it can really explore these questions in such a delicate and precise way. And we can think about the exploitation of music, particularly in relation to Black culture, this idea of some artists selling out, and this fine balance between sharing a culture and exploiting and selling out a culture. But above all that, interestingly and importantly, Chingonyi is always addressing this poem to us, those who choose not to dance, and he compels us to do so. He tells us to dance in reverence to the people who came before us and to the spirit of dance itself. So, Some Bright Elegance. The poem is essentially all about the transcendental quality of dance. The poet tells us to dance specifically as a form of rising above racial prejudice and hardships. And notice that the poem is written in free verse, with no defined poetic meter or rhyme scheme, but that it is still forced into a strict structure of 3 stanzas, each with exactly 8 lines. So perhaps the way that the poet uses structure could reflect the realities, specifically for Black communities, that despite living within the restrictions of a society that seems to hate or disregard them, they still find a way to express themselves. And this idea of breaking down barriers through dance is also evoked through the reference to different historical periods, such as Bojangles, zoot suits, and even back to West African villages, and perhaps all the way further back. And this really reminded me, if you haven't seen the film Sinners, I would really encourage you to watch this clip, and I'll link to it here, because it shows so clearly and evocatively what I think Chingonyi wants us to think about. And what it does is it features a blues singer who coincidentally is called Sammy, and he performs this song on the guitar, and he sings, and the people dance. And we see, as he performs and as these people dance, time and space breaks down, and we get the appearance of all these different people on the dance floor from both the past and future of Black music and dance. And I do think this is precisely what Chingonyi is writing about. Obviously not the scene from this film, but this spirit of dance and music that can transcend any form of societal hate and difficulty. So, a fascinating poem, one from early on in Chingonyi's career. And any thoughts at all, please leave them in the comments. I think this question of who we dance for is fascinating. And when we begin to answer that, the way that it encourages us to think about cultures, communities, and belonging, which are some of the key themes for Kumukanda, are really fascinating and eye-opening.